Hey, folks, this clip is brought to you by Farm Bureau Health Plans. For better coverage, better rates, and better service, go to fbhp.com/ATOZ. That is Farm Bureau Health Plans. Tennessee had a little bit of movement here this week on the football recruiting front. We're going to talk about all the recruiting for basketball. That's going to be the next segment. But this is football recruiting. They picked up Jeremiah Hurd, who is a 3-star defensive lineman prospect. This dude's really interesting because he's not rated on ESPN or Rivals yet. He's I would say, the definition of under the radar. But it's not because he hasn't shown out yet. It's because, according to the stuff I read, this dude started playing football last year. He's like new to the game of football. And I believe there's potential for offensive or defensive play, although he is listed as a defensive lineman at the moment, but potentially an offensive lineman. He is 6'8" and almost 300 pounds. 293 is what he's listed on On3's website. This dude is a monster. But again, a 3-star player on On3. He is the 95th defensive lineman in their rankings. Again, just a 3-star, but a fascinating pickup, I would say. This one's interesting just because of the nature of the kid, and he just started playing football last year, supposedly. What'd you think of this pickup, Zach?
Yeah, I think immediately you have to wonder. We talked about this before. Like, you can only have so many hidden gems in a class that you can count on, right? And you have to land the 4-star, 5-star guys. But what Josh Heupel has proven and his staff have proven to be good at is evaluating these guys early in the process, identifying them as players that they think will not necessarily rise in the rankings, because if we're to believe coaches, they don't pay any attention to those rankings, which I don't think any of us believe. But they basically think this guy is going to be a 4-star caliber guy. I mean, that seems to be the way they're recruiting. I think they know that they can't beat Alabama and Georgia for certain players just yet. And that's not a slight against Tennessee. I don't know that there's anything you can magically do to win those recruiting battles. Alabama, Georgia, they have so much recruiting equity that's just really hard to compete against. You're just going to have to beat them, stack these 11-win seasons on top of each other, start getting those results more frequently like you talked about, then you can win those battles. Until then, I think you have to identify guys early in the process, trust your evaluations, and see if they become what you think they'll be. They've done that a couple of times already. I assume this is what they're going for with this pickup.
Yeah, we've said it a bunch just in the last few weeks with the players that they've been getting. At a certain point, you just have to beat Georgia. Like, that's just something that teams can just do. Nobody did it this last season.
I mean, it's so easy if you're Kirby Smart to just say, I mean, they haven't beat me since 2016, my first year in Athens. Why? What can you say against that?
Yeah, I mean,
at least with Alabama, you can sell the win this past season.
Tom says it here. We need luck. There's a monster down in Georgia. I mean, yeah.
But this Hurd guy, if he can play, he is the type of body that you need to go up against Georgia, because that's what they're getting. So if the ones they're getting are already rated as 5 stars, you're hoping this guy develops into that.
I mean, 6'8", 293. The dude certainly has the physicality, but will he turn into the player that you need? At this point, I don't want to say it's all hope. I think he can be a good player as a 3-star. But there is certainly just an element of hope here where you go like, well, I hope he develops. We'll just have to see.
It'll be fascinating to watch his rise in the recruiting rankings, if he does rise over the next 6 to 8 months, especially over the summer.
Going to be watching it close just because of kind of how interesting he is as a prospect. He's going to be a real fascinating one to keep an eye on. But outside of Hurd, you had Amari McNeil, defensive lineman, hit the transfer portal. This is not – I always feel bad giving this take because Amari McNeil is going to go somewhere at just a slightly lower level, and he's going to find playing time, and that's what he wants, and that's what he should go get. He just wasn't going to play this season at Tennessee unless there were injuries, unless somebody fell off. He just wasn't going to carve out that spot. He got transfers came in and hopped him reportedly. Just your Omar Norman Lots and guys like that. It just wasn't the room was a little too stacked for him. And so
Though he did
was
reportedly have a decent spring, at least. It's not like
yeah,
he was just a terrible player. I think he probably going to be hard to crack the rotation, like you're alluding to there, but he wasn't just some cast off that they had no hope for type guy.
no, not at all. I mean, and it takes away a depth piece, which
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about all during spring ball. That's the best thing that's happened for Tennessee football this offseason is adding legitimate depth. But I think they still have it, even with this transfer and the transfer portal still open. You could pick up another defensive lineman. I don't see a huge need there, but it certainly wouldn't be a bad thing. I wouldn't hate it. I don't think they will, but we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think that they lose. I don't think they drop a game on their 2023 schedule because Amari McNeil's not on the team anymore.
Exactly. It's not a brutal loss. It's certainly not good, and I don't want to act like that at all. It's not good, but it's not devastating unless you have just a number of injuries on that defensive line, and that guy, he just ends up being a guy you really, really needed. But he just wasn't going to be a guy who's going to be a starter ultimately. And so there's that in terms of moving in the transfer portal. And we were just going to wrap up this conversation about recruiting and transfer portal by just saying, is there at this point, we've seen spring ball, and now you have until essentially August to potentially get more guys from the transfer portal. Is there anything that is calling out on this roster where Tennessee has needs? And we saw Josh Heupel, I believe it was at the Caravan, the Tennessee Caravan. They've been doing the tour across the state of Tennessee where all of the coaches meet with fans at this event, the Tennessee Caravan. And Heupel mentioned, do you have the wording there? You told me before the show started, but he mentioned something about potentially looking at the offensive line for transfer. What did he say?
And when he's in Nashville, he said, I think we can continue to add maturity at the offensive line position in particular. And specifically, we think he's talking about the offensive guard position because it seems like the tackles are pretty much figured out, that you're going to have John Campbell probably at left tackle and slide Mincy and Gerald Mincy and Jeremiah Crawford over to right tackle. Kind of a similar situation with Darnell Rice sliding over last season, which hopefully, that raises their level of play. But
I hope so.
When it comes to the interior offensive line, you have Javonte Spraggins, you have Cooper Mays that will be at center. That other guard position is a little bit up in the air, which is a bit of a surprise because we thought the transfer from Texas, Andres Carriage, was going to kind of take that position and run with it. Doesn't really seem like that's been the case. I mean, you've even seen like Ollie Lane mentioned as a possibility there. It seems like they would like to have some more options there. So it wouldn't be a total shock then, especially with Heupel's comments, if they go looking for an offensive guard in the next week or so before the portal closes.
Not at all. And that's the one to me that seems the most obvious. Seen some stuff floated around about potentially wide receivers, which from the portal, which seems interesting. Because you look at that room and you don't necessarily see like, oh yeah, we definitely need to pick up a wide receiver after you already got Dont'e Thornton. And you're pretty much, unless there are injuries, the dudes that are going to be your starting wide receivers at this point. So that's interesting. What was the deal there?
Farm Bureau Health Plans has been serving Tennesseans for over 75 years, and much has changed in Tennessee over the years, but some has stayed the same. Farm Bureau Health Plans has always valued personal relationships, especially when it comes to good health and good service. Plan on Farm Bureau Health Plans for health, dental, and vision. For better coverage, better rates, and better service, go to fbhp.com/ATOZ or walk into one of their 200-plus locations across the state of Tennessee. That is fbhp.com/ATOZ, Farm Bureau Health Plans.
Yeah, I mean, Vols 24/7 actually reported, I guess today, that Tennessee had been linked to TCU wide receiver at some point this offseason, Jordan Hudson, Hudson didn't do a lot at TCU last year, caught 23 passes for 170-some yards. But I think it tells you that maybe Tennessee isn't quite comfortable. Maybe it's not that they're not comfortable with their wide receiver room, but there's a lot of youth beyond those top four wide receivers that we've talked about with Thornton and Square White and Brew McCoy and Ramel Keaton. Once you get past there's a lot of talent, but there's not a ton of experience. So Hudson from TCU, he would come from I don't want to say similar offense because TCU is more air raid inspired, but it is a non-traditional offense. So it is something that maybe there's some stuff that translates there. So I could see him being a decent fit. I don't know if it's like a top priority for Tennessee by any means, but we saw last season how quickly wide receiver depth can be tested. So it just means that Tennessee wants to make sure they're not caught off guard or caught with a sudden weakness in 2023 that they didn't, maybe they had a chance to take care of before the season and they didn't. It's like they're trying to avoid that type of situation. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that because I'd like to see some of those young guys get a chance. I think some of them, like Square White, got chances at times this season where everybody's really excited about him moving forward in 2023. I think you got to give some of those guys a chance, but I also respect Heupel making sure the roster doesn't have any holes. I mean, I'm not going to say that Tennessee has championship expectations being put on them by the national media in 2023 because they're certainly not. They're not the front runners. Most people aren't, predicting them to even make the playoff with Hooker and Hyatt and Tillman and all those guys moving on. But in Josh Heupel's mind, in Tennessee's facility, they're going for it. I mean, they're going into 2023 expecting to go 15-0, and they're operating in that sense. So I can respect that part of it if they are looking to add another wide receiver.
Absolutely, because this is really an opportunity, I think, when you look across the landscape of the SEC East this season, there is the potential for it to basically be a two-team race, and it should be Tennessee and it should be Georgia. And if you can bolster your roster as much as possible, I think that opportunity is right there for you. Where that game, I mean, the game against Georgia is in, I believe, the beginning of November 8th,
it's in November.
Something like that. And there is legit potential. A lot has to happen before this, but there's legit potential where that game's for the SEC East. And that was essentially that way this season. Ultimately, we didn't know Tennessee was going to go get their doors blown off by South Carolina. But that game, thankfully, South Carolina game's in Neyland Stadium, and I think Josh Heupel is going to be out to slaughter.
Well, South they Carolina definitely will not be taking South. They won't be taking South Carolina lightly, which is exactly what happened last season. We heard Tennessee's players, various defensive players, pretty much straight up say that they did not think that game was going to be that close.
Exactly, and so I mean, you get past Florida in the swamp, which that's huge. I mean, that's massive. You haven't won in the swamp in however long, but you get past Florida in the swamp, you get past South Carolina. You're looking straight at that. Because you can lose to Alabama and beat Georgia and you still win the SEC East. If I'm thinking correctly, I believe that would be the case. So you're looking straight at that game and going, all right, the pass here. And so that, oh man, you have to just be thinking this is like an NFL team, like the Titans a couple years ago. What they should have been doing is bolstering everything for that Super Bowl run where the Rams a couple of years ago, where they just went, balls to the wall. It's all here for us. We just got to go and take it. And ultimately they won that Super Bowl. I don't know that Tennessee is relative to college football that good this season, but I think you have the potential because there is a fairly decent chance that things just come down to that Georgia game and that game's in Neyland Stadium. I mean, it's as winnable as it's probably going to get with Kirby Smart there. So
yeah, especially breaking in a new quarterback. Although that is the one downside of that game being in November is by then that quarterback has a year of experience. Carson Beck, I assume, would be the guy there. And Stetson Bennett, we made fun of him, but he was productive at Georgia. He did what he had to do to win games. He made some huge plays against Tennessee that really broke the defense's back. And regardless of what you think of him, he was a good college quarterback. He was obviously playing with some great athletes, a great offensive line. I don't think he has that same type of success at a school without those assets on the offensive side of the ball. But either way, he did his job and he did it pretty well at Georgia. Won 2 national championships. It's really hard to argue against him. If he had done that same thing at Tennessee and was the same quarterback, he'd be a living legend forever at Tennessee. So I can understand why Georgia fans love him so much despite his off-field transgressions, which have been pretty bad this spring. But aside from that, yeah, you don't have him there. They've lost some key players. They're going to reload, of course, like they always do. But the main thing is that the game is in Neyland. And I'm not going to say that that would have flipped the game last season, but it would have taken all those false starts out of the equation, and that would have helped Tennessee's offense a lot. And what they did with those opportunities, I don't know. I mean, we'll never know for sure, but it would have been a lot more winnable without that. So obviously that's going to be huge for Tennessee in this game.
Yeah, and with that in mind, to go back, that's why you got to just be scouring everything you possibly can to glue up any possible hole. And you go, the potential is here. Obviously, last year you won 11 games when nobody thought you would. Who knows what could happen now that you have even more depth than last season. So I think there's definite potential we see more movement in the transfer portal. Obviously, we will just have to see.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned tight end. I mean, that could definitely be another position of need, especially Ethan Davis with the collarbone issue should be fine for the 2023 season. But as good as he looked in the spring game, it was just a spring game. It was a very vanilla offense. He's still a true freshman. Very high on him. I think he has superstar potential in the SEC, but true freshman tight ends usually don't produce at a high level. You got Jacob Warren, who is, he's kind of a role player type guy, not really a go-to guy in the passing game, knows his job, is a huge asset for Tennessee. He's like another coach on the field. He basically is a tight ends coach on the field at this point. We've heard Tennessee's coaches say that multiple times this offseason. As far as in terms of production, I wouldn't look for a huge uptick in his production, which leaves, McAllen Castle's the new guy. It does feel like you could add some depth to that room for sure.